Right, child welfare is not a new phenomena for Canada, and it's not a new experience for Indigenous people. Child welfare has been the focus of the colonial process for multiple years, and you've heard a lot about residential schools, and that is a reality, a historical reality for Canada that is now seen somewhat historically. But I want to say that the child removal is still very much part of the services provided to Indigenous people. Has been through the process of Canadian colonization, and I dare say continues to be. And how does this happen that you have so many children removed? And the documentation on overrepresentation is very clear. It kind of goes back for us to the 50s when the residential schools, in fact, started closing, and they wanted to continue to focus on Indigenous children, whether this is through conscious policy and legislation or just the culture of the time. It was seen that Indigenous kids are most often better off outside of the Indigenous context, which is kind of a bizarre assertion, but the colonial mind gets quite distorted. So the idea that the Indigenous family is something that stands in the way of the good and welfare of Indigenous children has been an ideology that has permeated Canada's approach to Indigenous children. Now, I'll give it lots of credit for changing, but that historical reality has existed with us for multiple years. Indeed, we still have stories that go back where Indigenous folks believed that kids were being stolen and sold. And let me just reflect on that for a second, because what a powerful and horrible thing at the same time to say about a treatment of Indigenous peoples by a colonial government. But when you look at what the reality was, and I was a practitioner in the early days, I worked for an agency that really simply had apprehension of children and their placement as far away from their Indigenous reality as possible as the primary service. And Indigenous people believed at the time that, as I said, that their kids were bought and sold. And I'll tell you why that belief was in place, because most of these kids were sent to private adoption agencies in the States. When you listen to stories, I grew up in Connecticut, I grew up in Texas. I was doing these programs out of Winnipeg in Manitoba. Connecticut and Texas are pretty darn far away. So that reality of this child removal and sent far away and sold, how much did it cost to adopt an Indigenous child from northern Manitoba? Typically, the price was about 12,000 American dollars in the States through a private adoption agency. So, I'm not suggesting that this was, an outright mercantile relationship, but when you add money into the good and welfare of Indigenous children, or any child for that matter, it begins to distort it when it comes to a value. It's kind of this commodification of children. So there was a whole business historically in Canada of child removal, transfer to the States, money was transferred, and kids were supposedly to live happily ever after. The reality is most of them many did not live happily ever after. The research is still probably to come in terms of the extent of harms. But I've been in the field for many years, and even those who will come back, as we say, to our community, to our Indigenous communities, they will say, you know what, I had good adoptive families. I was loved. I was, they say very positive things, but all of them say, but you know what? I really wish I had a stronger connection to my Indigenous family. And the fact that that never happened is a sorrowful situation, because you can protect children at the same time as you can keep them under the umbrella of their family systems. But we were permeated back in the day with these notions of what an ideal family looks like. And there's nobody old enough in this presentation to know when I talk about the Cleaver family, Leave It to Beaver. There's sitcoms all over the place emanating from Southern California that were ingrating in our minds this notion of what an ideal family is. So when you look at an Indigenous family, a single mother, on welfare, living in a basement. She does not look like Ozzie and Harriet. She does not look like the idealized family. So it's very easy to say these kids need saving. And saving is actually part of the legacy of colonial rule. Britannia, I have a picture, I would have shown it to you had I could, of Britannia with a shield. And under that shield is all these kids with outstretched arms, and they're all different colors. And I'm going, well, that's a nice sentiment. And who can argue with something like that? But when you look at the values behind it, that Indigenous children are simply there to be saved, you get some legitimate questions. So what happened to these kids? What happened to all these kids that were apprehended in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, and into the 90s? And we're just doing a class action suit in Canada. And we've had so far 34,000 children who are now adults, some of them very, they were apprehended in the 60s. So they're well into adulthood, coming back and telling their stories and receiving, thankfully, some compensation for what and I was part of the court process that I was an expert witness on this that talked about what people might call the soul wound or the split feather. In any case, almost to a person, they would say, as good as my placement was, as good as my adoption was, I'm a mess. And Judge Bilibata here in Ontario stated that it was a man and actually granted compensation and granted $50 million towards the establishment of a foundational legacy. But even today, though, let's just speak about today about overrepresentation, because it's not an historical reality. It is a contemporary reality as well. And I'm part of, and I'm not an academic, but I'm one of those folks that, toys with everything. So I've been part of the steering committee on what we call the Ontario Incident Study, where we had a look at, just what's in child welfare that is still telling our community that they need this kind of intervention. And right now, apparently, and the stats are elusive, but there's more kids in care than have ever been. So, just how we come to the attention of the child welfare authorities. We come to the attention in multiple ways, but we are, many of our folks are life in a goldfish bowl. They get very few voluntary services like daycares and other kind of support services. They get police intervention, they get child welfare intervention, they get meme tested because they're poor. They go through a lot. It's a public life. And when people think that they are not performing in accordance with the standard of the day, you get the child welfare authorities knocking on the door and the process starts happening. You are, as an Indigenous person, almost 3 times more likely to be investigated by a child and family service agency than any other child in Canada. We call that the disparity of intervention. You are far more likely to end up in foster care or to be apprehended because of some problem expressed in your family. And I'm going to talk about those problems because there's some myths out there. At the end of the day, this, notwithstanding the reality that we have as an Indigenous community, taken back so many of our services, we're finding we're inheriting some of the conditions that actually cause apprehension. And those real conditions, and I want to say this to you very bluntly, have to do with poverty. We like to spin sometimes that the problems of poverty are expressed in child abuse. But when you look at actually the statistics associated with child abuse, the Indigenous family only represents about 5% of the reasons for kids coming into care. The other percentage is caregiver, lack of skills or mental illness or addictions or lack of housing. All these conditions are associated with poverty. So some of the insiders, such as myself, talk about this phenomena being the neglect of the neglect. In other words, we're neglecting to look at some of the structural conditions built in within our society that keeps our people from participating fully and keeps them poor and keeps them in a goldfish bowl. So the point I was making that for the Indigenous sector, notwithstanding, a lot of people, there's been myth associated, or false belief, or whatever we want to call it, that we're more likely to be abusive to our children, sexually abusive. We have heard that for many years, but when the scrutiny of research actually looks at it, it's the debilitating impact of child poverty that is actually bringing kids to foster care. And it's also the inability of the Indigenous sector, because it too is poor. Not are just the families poor, but the Indigenous service system. I want to say that's changing. Native Child is a good example of that. But high need and low level of response has been what has followed from the colonial process. So it's a real struggle for the Indigenous sector to kind of catch up and start doing things differently. But we are. I know I'm probably running out of time, but nationally there has been a movement, and it started in the 90s. It started with horrific stories that were coming to light about kids. We had a kid 16 years old on a sentence to death in Texas because he killed his adoptive father, who had been abusing him for multiple years. So only through that kind of tragedy was the consciousness changed, but it has been changed. Legislation has been changed, and there's been a transfer of authority and funding. And we are building right now, in the process of building an Indigenous response. And the focus of that response is different. We do not see the family as toxic. We see the family as an opportunity. And so we focus our child and family services, and I'm talking about right across this country, all Indigenous-led services, on family preservation. We also focus on what I mean by family preservation. The first service is not investigation in child welfare for abuse or neglect. The first contact we try to make is, can we get your kid into daycare? Can we get you as a 19-year-old single mother into a parenting program where you can be mentored by an older Indigenous woman? We have a program, for example, called the Noosh, who I think HIT funds have been involved with back in the day when we first started it, where we have created an auntie. Many of our moms living in basements in downtown Toronto and such, they don't have a family. Their family's 2,000 kilometers away from here. And they're 19 years old with a child living in a basement apartment, and they're isolated. So we have a program, for example, that will do outreach to them, that will do supports. I actually wrote the job description that said, I don't want a job description. You do whatever an auntie does traditionally. And we know that an auntie, I had my Auntie Mina for sure, I still remember her wagging her finger at me to behave. So that kind of real-time kind of creation of support programs for Indigenous families early in the day, some kind of poverty relief. And what I mean by that is the acquisition of decent housing. And I know these are structural issues, and they don't lend themselves to a simple grant here and there. But I think until such time we get at those structural issues, we're going to continue to have these problems. But it's not just that. We have mental health issues that come after so many years of colonization. We've got a lot of depression, we have a lot of opiate issues in many of our communities. They're ringing the bell that's a serious crisis. But I want to say we also have a lot of strength and a lot of potential. Our services, as I said, are into family preservation, but early intervention as well. Native Child provides four, I'm losing touch even of the amount of services we actually have, or daycare services, early intervention services. We have an extensive clinical and healing program related to addictions and mental health, because we know the legacy of child welfare or colonialism per se is addictions and mental health. So we're trying to get at some of the causes. But what we don't have, to kind of wind this up a little bit, is a strong response to child abuse as typically envisioned as some parent behaving very badly and cruelly to their kids. Truly, I've been in the business for so many years. I have seen a few what we would call sociopathic parents, and we definitely need to. But to my mind, that's more of a criminal dynamic. The actual business of child welfare is kind of supporting these families that has inherited so much in terms of a negative legacy from the colonial process. So our services are geared towards kind of changing that. It's a work in progress, and it's a national movement. Just to extend this internationally, the impact on Indigenous communities through colonization is an international phenomena. And almost in every scenario that I've looked at, there's big issues with respect to how it's approached. The integrity of the Indigenous families. Child removal is very much alive and well right across, including the US. I know that for sure. So we got a long way to go. And organizations like Hedge Funds Canada or Hedge Funds International can certainly play a role in that, because I'll tell you what you do. Although the grants aren't enormous, they are significant enough to allow some research and development. And because it's not tied to government, and because we can establish a working relationship that frees us up a little bit from that kind of constraint, we can do some really innovative stuff. So you folks have the potential of really being change makers along with the developing Indigenous community. I have a lot more I could say. I think I've covered more than my 10 minutes, so I'll
and thank you. Thank you so much, Kenn. It's terrific to hear you talking. Does anyone have any questions or thoughts or observations for Kenn?
Well, I got to hop in here. Kenn, I got to say thank you very much, on behalf of Canada. You've been a partner from the very beginning, and it's been incredible. And you've actually pioneered some really fascinating and amazing programs that I know have been shared throughout the HFC network with other academics, and certainly looked into in terms of maybe, being either replicated or in some way put forward in other areas where it's in need. But the focus on kids needing help and just the ways you've approached it have been awesome. And it's been amazing being a partner with you. So thank you.
Well, thank you. You guys have been, you go back now. We have an old relationship. This is nothing new. So it's, again, when I had an opportunity to come and say these words, I leapt at it.
Okay. As a fellow Canadian, I'm just curious, Kenn. I'm from British Columbia, and my dad was actually from Winnipeg. And so this kind of hits near and dear to home.
Yeah.
You mentioned the sort of national movements. Can you just comment on the national sort of provincial politics and how things are aligned, or how things are just a complete disconnect?
Well, I'm going to say that, the system is shaken up. There's been some litigation, for example, as you may be aware of. In Canada, we part of the number of initiatives. One of them is, I hate to put it so bluntly, but suing the government for their lack of attention to Indigenous children. So I've been part of class actions and such that have resulted in the federal government actually moving very progressively forward. I guess they're tired of being litigated. So they've introduced legislation that is going to start supporting an Indigenous framework. They used to simply support and didn't support or didn't support at all, just the conventional child welfare approach. But now they've understood the importance of prevention, early intervention, investment, and structural issues. So they've introduced something called C-92, which is a new piece of legislation that if you want to Google that, you'll be quite impressed with the progressive nature of it. Has it rolled out? No. Do the feds even have jurisdiction? Nobody's quite sure, because we got an awkward constitution here on that. So right now the province is also, because who wants litigation? And truly, I think most want to do the right thing now. They are changing their legislation. And the challenge is truly nationally. And here's where I'm going to make a pitch to you guys again, is while all this stuff is happening at the high level, at the neighborhood level, at the community level, at the service level, lots of supports are still required. Lots of, if I were to say pitch Hedge Funds Canada, investing in capacity development on the part of the Indigenous community itself to address some of the more fundamentals, to present an Indigenous model, because it's happening everywhere. Vancouver has VACFAS, we call it, Vancouver Area First Nation. Anyway, Bernadette Spence, the ED there, another Manitoban. By the way, I'm from Winnipeg. So, we call ourselves the Manitoba Mafia right across this country. So there is this movement, and it's in every province. And there's many agencies right now, Indigenous agencies, including Native Child, that are full authorities. They do everything. So we have taken back really that fundamental responsibility. But as I said, it's a work in progress. And that's where, again, I find myself pitching you guys, but this is where you guys might come in and be more helpful. As helpful as you've been, you could continue.
Ken, that was a really interesting presentation. I'm Cliff. I'm joining you from Hong Kong. I'm also new to HFC. For the last 10 years or so, I've been looking at informal social control of child maltreatment. So when formal services are not available, we've been looking at what communities do and what seems to work in terms of child protection just within the community without formal child welfare services. And I guess what I wanted to ask is, are there parts of Canada where you feel like there's enough of an Indigenous community where that could be part of the solution to kind of have communities take ownership of protecting the children, having a child welfare come in less?
Absolutely. But let me give you a real time, because I just dealt with this last week and it's unresolved. First Nation in southwestern Ontario wants to establish a safe house. And that, it's a really loose title, safe house, but it's simply a place for kids in distress for whatever reason can go in the community and get and achieve safety and achieve some kind of resolution, hopefully, to their problems. And the band was about to buy or construct a house and get it going, and the powers that be just descended upon them and hit them with so many regulations and so many legislative encumbrances and barriers that they pretty much given up. And a lot of this has to do with a mindset that we don't want to talk about too openly, but it's the belief that Indigenous people don't have the competence to do anything complicated. But it's also forgiveness to any lawyer on this panel. But the risk and liabilities have been presented as such that it's a dangerous enterprise. I'm going, how is something that is makes so much sense? My mother with a grade 3 education could understand this, and yet it's an impossible to do. Well, the system doesn't allow it. The system has to be deconstructed before it can actually support the kind of services that you're talking about. But they are happening. They're happening informally. Indigenous life is a collective life, as is many of the folks right around this world. And your auntie has an obligation to help. But it used to be that auntie can't help, we'll take you into care and send you to Connecticut. Now auntie is coming into the picture. So that's the kind of focus that has to happen. And it is happening here in Canada. But again, it's not facilitated very well by legislation or funding.
Right, over-regulated maybe.
Totally, and risk managed. The belief that the family's toxic, that there's danger everywhere, and you have to, of course, pay attention. I've been in child welfare for 40 years, for God's sake. I know how dangerous the world can be, but it mostly isn't. It mostly isn't. It's mostly people simply overwhelmed with problems that need a hand up. They do.
Yeah. Thank you.
Hey, Ken, this is Dean Backer. I thought the discussion was fascinating. I had one quick question. I think you referenced the number 34,000. Was that the number of children and families affected over the 3.5 decades, or was that the number of folks that participated in the class action suit?
It was those who signed on to the class action suit. There's a number of stipulations associated with it. It is by no means an inclusive number. There'd be far more.
That's what I thought.
Let me be blunt. Many are dead.
Right.
This goes back to the 50s. So when you look at statistical expectations associated with Indigenous life, you can see that just like with the residential schools, this stuff rolls out sometimes. People are gone. So there would be, 60, I would guess it's at least double that.
Right. I was going to say, is it kind of a dimension of 2x roughly?
It's at least double that, I believe.
Thank you.
Hi, Ken. I'm Jennifer Collins. I'm based in the Cayman Islands, but like Jeff, I'm a transplanted Canadian from the East Coast. I just wanted to say how interesting I thought your presentation was. And actually, I have a social worker sister, and she's based in the Northwest Territories and practicing in child welfare there and kind of dealing with the day-to-day. A lot of their people, the parents, are victims of the 60s scoop. And so I think it's been really interesting to kind of hear your perspective and how much it echoes very much the people on the ground and kind of facing those realities. And she's been doing a lot to educate us from the other parts of Canada, the rest of my family, on just because a family looks different doesn't mean it can't be productive. And so that was a real challenge. And so it was really interesting to kind of hear, very consistent themes from somebody who's kind of part of that reform that's happening in child welfare in the North.
I want to express my thanks to Head Funds Canada. You've been one of those funders that have came in early. We're flexible in terms of what we did. You know, we've done a few presentations to the Canadian folks, and yeah, it's a relationship that we value very much, and want to continue further. We and you know, I'm out of time, but we're doing a lot of inroads now and into philanthropy, private philanthropy. Only 1% of Canadian charitable dollars actually go to Indigenous people. And my new mission, I tilted windmills everywhere. So my new mission is to change that up. So these sort of talks that I just did with you is to stimulate the conversation and to see, you know, what kind of, as Sitting Bull said, what kind of life we can make together for our children.
Thank you so much, Ken. I think I expressed for all of us how much we appreciate your work and everything you're doing, and look forward to partnering with you into the future. So thank you, thank you, thank you.
I'm going to sign off now. Is that what I do?
Yep, I think so. And we'll talk soon.
Very nice to meet everybody. Have a good days. It's exciting to talk to people around the world, actually. So very nice. See you later.
Thank you, Ken.
Thank you, Ken.